Go. So I just wanted to make sure everybody's in the right Zoom. So this is implementing appropriate accommodations and modifications. And I'm going to go ahead and pop this PowerPoint into the chat box so that you guys have it just in case you didn't get it. So go ahead and open that up. And we'll go ahead and get started. So I just wanted to say hello and welcome to everybody. My name's Trisha Mendenweto, and I am the induction coordinator for Puck Schools. I'm going to give you guys a little bit of my background. So I did start in education way back when. I started teaching at a non-public school, which is a school just for students with IEPs with very severe behavioral needs. So I taught high school math there for about 4 years. And then I jumped over to Puck, where I was a resource specialist, and I did that for about 5 years. After that, I was our inclusion coach at Puck Schools, so I got to support all of the teachers at Puck across our 14 school sites. And then most recently, I moved over into the induction coordinator position. So that's my professional background. I also have 2 really cute kids. My son is 6 years old and my daughter's a 1.5 years. I call her my pandemic baby because I had her like 2 weeks after lockdown. So those are just some fun facts about me. So I do want to know who's here. So if you could please share in the chat box your name, your school site, your role, and one thing you're thankful for and why. So I put my example here. My name, my school site, I work for all of Puck Schools, my position. And then one thing I'm thankful for is, of course, my kids, because they make me smile. So go ahead and pop in the chat box your little blurb, and I'll give you guys about a minute to do that. Ooh, thankful for another year around the sun. Yes. I find that after the pandemic, I find more things to be thankful for, such as, just spending time with family and friends. Thankful for my job. I see someone's thankful for their cat. Jenny's thankful for her cat. Awesome. Thank you guys so much. Continue to pop those in there for me. I do have to report back to your organizations just to let them know who came. So that'll be an easy way for me to let them know you are here. Okay, so just some Zoom etiquette. You will have some time to individually process information. We will be working in breakout rooms a little bit. So again, if you can turn on your camera during that time, I know sometimes it takes a lot of bandwidth, and there will be some opportunities to share whole group. So here is our agenda. First, why adaptations? Second, what are adaptations? And we're going to talk about the difference between accommodations and modifications and why that's important. And then we'll have some time to think about our application in the real world. Okay. For our session objectives, so you will be able to understand the why behind adaptations, identify the differences between accommodations and modifications, and then problem solve adaptations to remove students' barriers to learning. Okay, so I implanted these little like stretch breaks because we've all had a long day. So if you just want to like stretch your neck a little bit, your chin, roll your shoulders, every transition we'll be having a little stretch break just to take care of ourselves, right? So first of all, we have this illustration, and I want you to think about what you notice. In the top, we have equality, and in the bottom, we have equity. So independently, just for 1 minute, you're going to think about what you notice. You're going to type your response in the chat box, but you're not going to hit enter just yet. We'll all hit enter together at the end of 1 minute. Okay. So again, 1 minute to go ahead and notice what you see in this illustration. All right, so now I'm going to give you guys about 20 seconds to finish typing your response in the chat box, and then go ahead and hit enter when you're finished. And you guys can go ahead and read everyone's responses. Mm-hmm. I'm seeing that in the top. Everybody gets the same bike, right? And that doesn't exactly give everybody access to riding a bike. In the bottom, people are pointing out that everybody gets what they need. Everybody gets a bike based on their unique needs, yes. Thank you guys. So you're all correct in your observations, and this is why we're thinking about adaptations for our students. We want to have this in mind. A lot of times people are like, everybody should get the same. But when we really think about even this simple example, we really want equity. We want everyone to get what they need. And here's this wonderful quote: fairness does not mean everybody gets the same. Fairness means everyone gets what they need. All right. And in this simple illustration, this little boy has glasses, which is actually an accommodation if we think about it. And these other little girls don't have glasses. And of course we would be like, of course that's fair, or of course that's, right, that everybody gets what they need. But sometimes when we translate supports in the classroom, sometimes we feel like giving extra supports to some students doesn't feel fair, when in actuality it is. So here's just some laws that support adaptations. We have our civil rights law, the ADA, to prohibit discrimination for people in employment, public services, and accommodations. IDEA is an educational act, and it guarantees special education and related services. And then 504 is also a civil rights law. And you can read more about these laws if you click on that link there. So oftentimes I get the question of who is responsible for implementing these adaptations. So if you actually look at students' IEPs, which I highly recommend, you will see an area here that says responsible personnel. And you can see on this IEP that it says who's responsible: our special education teacher, our general education teacher, and other providers. So that might be the assistants in your classroom or what have you. But these people all have a role in making sure that students get their accommodations and modifications. What are the purpose of these supports? So we want all of our students to have access to the curriculum. We want them to be successful. And we also want students to be able to demonstrate what they know. Sometimes the way we ask students to demonstrate things doesn't play to their strong suit. And as teachers, we want to know what they know, right? So before we shift gears to what are adaptations, you're just going to do a little stretch. Elbow stretch, wrist, back stretch, back arching. Oh, all right, thank you. So what are adaptations? It's any change or adjustment in the environment or materials that enhances the performance of a student within an instructional activity. So adaptations is the umbrella term for under which accommodations and modifications fall, all right? And we're gonna dive a little more deeply into those terms. So accommodations versus modifications. Accommodations change how a student learns or demonstrates mastery. Okay, that's the big keyword, how. Now this can be implemented informally by a teacher. So a student doesn't need to have an IEP or a 504 or an SST in order to implement accommodations. Teachers have that agency to decide like, hey, this student needs more support. Let me try XYZ, all right? More oftenly, it is provided formally through a family support team meeting, a student success team meeting, an IEP, or a 504. Now for modifications, which are different from accommodations, it changes what the student is learning. Okay, and this must be implemented by an IEP, and the student must be put on alternate curriculum. Cannot be implemented by a 504, so that's a key difference. Also, what's important to know is that if a student is on alternate curriculum in high school, they get a certificate of completion. They do not get a high school diploma. And why that's important is if that student decides to go to community college, later on in his or her life, he or she cannot apply for financial aid. So that's why when I was an IEP case manager, I was very careful to put a student on alternate curriculum because I wanted to give them enough time and resources to see like, can we get that high school diploma? Because technically a student with an IEP can stay in high school till they're 22. So they can take their time to get that high school diploma. And I'm gonna pause because I've done a lot of talking. If you have any questions, feel free to pop them in the chat box right now, and I can do my best to answer them. All right, I don't see any questions. I will check in again later. So here we have 9 types of curriculum adaptations. Again, adaptations is the umbrella term. So depending on the learning standard, the adaptation is going to be an accommodation or a modification, and we'll dig a little deeper again later. And these ones in red are always modifications. So depending on the learning standard, it could go either way, accommodation or modification. So quantity is reducing the item amount. Instead of 20 math problems, they're doing 10. Time is changing the amount of time. Now it could mean more time. They have double time to complete a test, or it could be less time. I actually had a student with an IEP where I had to put him on a timer and I'd be like, okay, you have 10 minutes to write this essay. He was brilliant, but he needed that time constraint in order to produce work. So it could mean more time, less time, pacing. Support is getting support perhaps from a peer or a teacher, an assistant, where other students may be independent. Input is how are they receiving the information? Are they receiving it auditorily, visually, Are there manipulatives? What is being used to teach them the content? Difficulty, so the level at which they're asked to perform. Maybe on the math test, they might need that calculator or multiplication chart. Output is how are students responding? How are they showing what they know? Are we expecting them to write something? Can they do like a Flipgrid video where they explain what they're doing? Can they create a PowerPoint? What plays best to their strength? Participation, how are they participating? I once had a student with autism who was nonverbal, but his ideas were great. So for whole group presentations, he inputted information on the PowerPoint and he ran the PowerPoint while his other group members did the verbal presenting. For alternate goals, this is when they have the same materials but different goals. And again, this is always a modification. So for an example, if the class is reading Frankenstein and they're tracking the themes throughout, a passage, and our student who's on alternative curriculum, maybe they're still engaging with Frankenstein, but instead of looking at themes, they're looking at main ideas. So that's a different goal, and that's a modification. For substitute curriculum, this is different materials and goals. So if we go with our Frankenstein example, the class is reading Frankenstein, they're looking at themes. Our student on alternate curriculum, we're like, Frankenstein isn't really accessible to her. So we're gonna have her read a book that's at her level, and we're gonna work on decoding words, okay? So are there any questions on this before I move on? Okay. And this is not to say that you must provide an adaptation in every single area. It's for when you have a student and you're like, I've tried everything. And then you go to this and you're like, wait, have I considered input? Have I considered, switching up the difficulty? It's for that purpose of support.
I just have one question. So
yeah,
as far as providing a more accessible text, so let's say we were doing Frankenstein or any other classic that might not be accessible for a lot of students, would maybe providing them with an illustrated version of the classic be another possible modification.
Yeah.
Story, but just more visual.
Yes. So that is a great example, and I'm glad you brought that up. So a lot of times we have like the classic text Frankenstein, and then there are those like graphic novel Frankensteins, and we want to look at the standard. What does the standard say? Does the standard say, they must identify themes, or does the standard say they must use Frankenstein? So more often than not, the standard says themes, and that might go under input and difficulty. So I would actually consider that an accommodation. So thank you for bringing that one up. That one is tricky. It is like alternate input. Any other questions? All right, we're gonna move on. So we are gonna play some Kahoot just to review our understanding. So you're gonna go to www.kahoot.it and pop in that game pin, and I'll put it in the chat box. Ooh, I already see someone on there, Mackenzie. There it is. So I'll give you guys a minute to log on there. We have 32 people logged on. I'll give you guys about 10 more seconds to log on, then we'll get started. We're almost at 100%, y'all. All right, I'm gonna go ahead and get started. If you can't log on, you can just watch and think which one you would select. Instead of presenting to the whole class, the student presents to the teacher. What would that fall under? Participation. Yes. Very nice. We have Mark, Monica, and Mackenzie on top. Instead of writing a 500-word essay, student writes 400 words. It is quantity. I could see an argument for output. We're changing the amount of output, but we're not changing the type of output. All right, there are leaders. Instead of working independently, student is supported in a small group with the teacher. We all got that one correct. It is support. Ooh, staying pretty consistent. Instead of writing a response, student explains thinking out loud to an adult. It is output. Oh, very consistent, y'all. Having an alternate learning goal is always a modification. This one is true. Whenever we're switching the goal, it becomes a modification. The goal is what needs to stay the same. All right, we got a little bit of switching up. Changing the difficulty of an assignment is always an accommodation. Ooh, and this one is false. So if the standard says the student must add and subtract double-digit numbers, if that's the standard, and our student is only doing single-digit numbers, that's actually a modification. So whatever the learning standard is, we need to stay true to that learning standard. And so the difficulty, changing the difficulty may or may not be an accommodation or a modification, depending on that standard. And I'm hoping we can drive that point a little bit more with the next activities. But yes. Oh, there's another one I forgot. Depending on the learning standard, changing the difficulty can be an accommodation or a modification. Yes, true. Very nice. Okay, let's see our podium. Jennifer, third place. Emily, very nice. Let's see who it is. Drum roll, Mark. Very nice. So you guys get bragging rights? All right, we're gonna hop back to our presentation. So here we're gonna go over some examples. Here's an English example. So let's say our learning standard is to retell stories. And the assignment that the teachers decided to do is having students independently read The Very Hungry Caterpillar and then write 5 sentences to retell the story. Okay. So here's an example of some possible accommodations. So instead of writing, the student retells the story orally. So I need to check, does that hit the learning standard? It does. So it's an accommodation. Okay. Here, the student is asked to write 3 sentences to retell the story instead of 5. Again, they're still hitting that learning standard. Here, the student is asked to draw a comic strip of the story with captions that retell the story. Okay, they're still retelling the story, so we're good. Those are all possible accommodations. Now, some modifications are if our student is just listening to peers retell the story. They're not actually retelling the story themselves, so that's a modification. If our student is just writing a sentence of a key detail, that's not retelling the story, so that's a modification. If the student is drawing a picture for the cover of the story, that doesn't include retelling the story. So that would be considered a modification, right? And I'm gonna pause to see if there's any questions. You could pop it in the chat or unmute yourself. Okay, I'm gonna go to the next slide. So here's a math example. Our learning standard is to use addition and subtraction within 20 to solve word problems. And our assignment is a 30-question quiz. So some accommodations are a quiz with 15 questions. If we're still testing on this standard, but there's less questions, that's okay. That's an accommodation. We're giving the student double time to complete the quiz. That's okay. We're giving the student manipulatives to work with during the assessment. They're still hitting that learning standard. That's an accommodation. Also, if we provide visuals of the word problems on their paper, that's an accommodation. They're still hitting that learning standard. For modifications, let's say we're giving them a quiz on counting. That's a completely different learning goal. That's a modification. If we're saying that we want them to identify numbers, that's also not hitting our goal. Or if we're saying word problems within 10, that's a modification because the standard says 20. Okay, and I'm gonna, great question. If we give them less questions, how do we input that for grades? Yes, so usually what I do for grades, when I taught, I would do 1 out of 10 and I would just do a percentage. So let's say they had 15 questions and they got, 80% of them correct, I would give them an 8 out of 10. And same thing here, I would just take the percentage and input it as that so that the grades are all, equally weighted. Um, any other questions before I move on? Okay. So we are going to do a Jamboard, and I can pop this in the chat box. So go ahead and open that, and I'm going to explain the directions before I put you into breakout groups to do this together. So you're going to drag each yellow Post-it either under accommodation or modification, right? When you're done dragging them and deciding what belongs where, the pink one is for you to write a new accommodation and a new modification. The learning standard is when heating or cooling substances, don't do it just yet. I know you guys are excited. The total weight of matter is conserved. The assignment that the teacher decided on is to write a paragraph explaining what happens to the weight of water when it is freezed. Okay. When it says student just makes Jell-O to see how a liquid changes to a solid, that's all that they're doing. If it says in a small group, students write the paragraph, we're assuming that they're still doing the rest of it. All right. So I have created different slides for different groups. So depending on the breakout room that you're in, you're going to go to that slide. Okay. Are there any questions? Oh, it says there's too many people trying to access. I wonder if I can make a copy of this. Make a copy. I'll put half of you on the copy one and then half of you on the original one. I didn't expect so many people to come, which is great. Share. Okay, let me see. There are 50. So I'm going to put you guys into 20 groups. So groups 1 through 10 will be on the original one. And then groups 11 through 20 will be on the copy. And let's try that to see if it works, hopefully with less people. Okay. So I will put you into breakout groups of 20. Any questions before I send you guys into breakout groups? So group 11, you're actually going to use page 1. Group 12, use page 2, and so forth. All right, I'm going to send you guys off for about 7 minutes. Welcome back. So now we're going to talk about application in the real world, and I hope you got a chance to stretch. So we're going to go through, let me share my screen, this support. It says goal of the activity, potential barriers, and supports to overcome barriers. So here's the example. When we're looking at the goal of the activity, let's say our goal is to find the area of right triangles. So here we have it. If I'm thinking about a student, some potential barriers I might think of are paying attention to the lesson, remembering multi-steps to solve this problem. So some supports that might be helpful to overcome these barriers, or maybe I'm going to do a video so the student can watch it multiple times at his or her own pace. Perhaps the student may benefit from fidgets or brain breaks to help with that focus. And usually I would always provide a graphic organizer so that it breaks up the problem into steps with the first one completed, and my students can reference that. Just a highlight on fidgets. I know students are back from distance learning, and a lot of them have trouble, staying still for a long time to focus on the lesson. So these are just some ideas of things to have in the classroom for students to grab and really help them with that focus. Also, brain breaks. Goal Noodle is a good one for younger students. Our DIS Counseling Center, if we look here, has some other activities for brain breaks. With my classes, I would play Simon Says. I would play Math Simon Says. I would ask them a math question, and then they'd have to show me on their fingers what the answer was. And that was fun. So depending on the grade level that you have, there's going to be an appropriate type of brain break. Okay. So now we're going to go into the application piece where you're going to think of your own lesson. And you can click on here for some adaptation quick reference lists of ideas of what you might use to support your students. So you're going to think about the goal of your upcoming activity, what potential barriers you might encounter with your students, and then you're going to brainstorm some supports. And again, you can use this list to come up with ideas. You can also think through these categories that we went over. So you'll do that for 3 minutes and then independently, and then we'll come back and you'll be in a small group for 5 minutes to share your ideas with one another. So thank you so much for sharing in your small groups. And I just want to urge you guys that you're going to, come up with supports and you're going to put them in front of your students, and they may not work, or maybe they do work. But I want to urge you that if the supports you implemented don't work, try something different. And eventually you're going to find something that's going to give them the success that they're looking for. And if anything, the students will just see how much you care when you're trying new supports with them. Please fill out this feedback survey just to give us an idea of how we did tonight. And thank you for participating. Here's my name and information at the bottom. Feel free to email me with any questions you might have or supports. But thank you for participating.